Dear colleagues, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Thank you for connecting so numerously to today's launch webinar of the report National and Subnational Food Systems Multi-Stakeholder Mechanisms, an Assessment of Experiences. My name is Patrick Mink. I am a Senior Policy Officer at the Federal Office for Agriculture in Switzerland and co-lead of the One Planet Network's Sustainable Food Systems program, and I will be moderating this webinar. I would like to take this opportunity to thank in particular those organizations that have funded this report, namely the German Ministry for the Environment, Nature and Conservation and Nuclear Safety, and the CGIAR flagship program, Food Systems for Healthier Diets. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions that you would like to ask to the speakers during the webinar, please type them in the chat box so we can take them up later on in the Q&A session. So first of all, I would like to briefly outline the objectives and the agenda of the webinar. The objectives of the webinar are to introduce the report on multi-stakeholder mechanisms, its methodology, the highlights, the main findings and the key takeaways, and this will be done via a presentation by the main author of the study report. The second objective of the webinar will be then to discuss the key challenges, achievements and drivers of success of the studies as sustainable food systems multi-stakeholder mechanisms, and this will be done via a panel discussion and following Q&A session. And the third objective of the webinar is to discuss the potential of multi-stakeholder mechanisms as governance vehicles for the much needed food systems transformation. And this will be done by the final remarks and wrap up at the end of the webinar. With this, let me briefly outline the agenda. So we will start with an introduction on the importance of sustainable food systems and why transformation is necessary, including some recommendations by Martina Fleckenstein, followed by then the presentation of the report. After that, after the report by the author, by Carmen Torres, we will go into a panel discussion where we will have several champions of food systems stakeholders, food systems mechanisms, multi-stakeholder mechanisms, debating about the role of these mechanisms for the food systems transformation, followed by the Q&A, and finally by the wrap up and closing of the session. So this is the agenda. And with this, without any further ado, I would now like to invite our first speaker, Martina Fleckenstein, to present the background of this initiative and to outline and to provide her views on the need for food systems transformation. Martina is the Global Policy Manager Food at WWF International, and you may have been in touch with her during the preparatory process for the UN Food Systems Summit, in particular on issues around the topic on boosting nature-positive production. Please, Martina, you have the floor.
Thanks, Patrick, and a warm welcome to all participants that joined this webinar, in which you will learn more about the national and subnational food system multi-stakeholder mechanism, like Patrick already indicated, and especially how they might be contributed to the implementation of the more than urgent food system transformation. And food systems have increasingly got in the focus of global discussions over the last year, in particular in the run up to the UN Food System pre-summit and summit, and that's good and that's important. And when we talk about food systems, we are considering the production, the processing, the transport, food loss and waste, consumption and diets. And we need to recognize that our food systems are connected to human and animal health, to climate and biodiversity. And if we consider our food systems, we know that a transformation is urgent because food production uses 70% of freshwater resources, and it's one of the primary drivers for the loss of biodiversity. 30% of our food is lost and wasted. And at the same time, 811 million people are suffering from hunger. Fish stocks are being depleted at an unsustainable rate, and food systems account for approximately 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. And next week, the climate COP will start, and without transformation of our food system, without mitigation and adaptation actions, we will not reach the 1.5 target of the Paris Agreement. And let me summarize, food systems are the single biggest threat for nature and people, but, and that's the optimistic thing, their transformation represents the greatest opportunity to achieve the SDGs. You may think these are all facts that most of you have already heard about. But the real question is, and that's what we will talk today about, is how do we transform and how could we transform food system? What pathways can we make that can efficiently lead to a change? What we need, first of all, we need to continue raising awareness and understanding on the need of transition to a new holistic way of thinking about food systems. And as I already mentioned before, we need to shift to a mindset that considers not only the production of food, but also needs to deal with the elements that shapes consumption, which means our diets, and which means food which we waste. And in this sense, first and foremost, we need policies that take a holistic approach, which means a systemic and integrated and a transformative approach to align human and environmental health, which is not the case at the moment. It also needs to touch all aspects of food systems, which means boosting nature positive production at scale, reduce food loss and waste, improve nutrition, improving livelihoods, respecting human rights, and creating resilience to vulnerability and shocks. And secondly, in order to link these interrelated challenges and topics, we need to bring together the relevant key actors across the different areas of food, and which means the government, the private sector, the science, the civil society, and particularly the ones who produce the food, the farmers and the fisher folks. In the last year, several international and multiracial efforts have been contributing to convening stakeholder and decision-making process. I have already mentioned the UN Food System Summit, but also the long-standing CFS, the Committee for Food Security, the most multi-stakeholder of UN bodies. And I would like to highlight in this context the importance of the Sustainable Food System Program in the One Planet Network in bringing together different stakeholders at global level. And in this context, I think the relevance, this multi-stakeholder mechanism constitutes an important element for the embedding of collaborative and coordinated food system approaches in policy at national and global level. The next year will offer a number of opportunities, such as the conferences of the party, as already mentioned, the climate COP starting in 1 week, the biodiversity COP at the end of April next year, and the UNCCD, the Land Convention COP, which will happen in May next year, beside a lot of other approaches. And we need to build up this multi-stakeholder cooperation. We need to scale up the multi-stakeholder cooperation. And that's what this session is all about. We will learn in this session about the challenges and opportunities of participatory multi-stakeholder mechanism in a discussion with distinguished panelists. And we will learn from the study finding. And here it's concrete takeaways based on a range of concrete cases, both at national and subnational level. Let me close and summarize with 4 remarks. And just what we need is to integrate the food system approach into all relevant policy, get out the silos at global, at national, at regional level. We need a global shift to nature positive production, a production which protect nature, rely on regenerative and agroecological practices, and that rehabilitate the function of degraded systems. And we must address the consumption. This is to reduce food loss and waste, and even more, a transition to healthy and sustainable diets. Collaboration at all levels is crucial. A food system needs to be inclusive and collaborative. where all stakeholders are involved in designing and implementing relevant intervention. And I'm very happy now to hand back to Patrick and to the next speaker and learn about the global mechanism to improve our food system. Thank you. Back to you, Patrick.
Yes, thank you very much, Martina, for this background and for laying out the urgency of the transformation and really the need then for holistic policies and an integrated approach, and thus the need to bring relevant actors together, and therefore the importance of such multi-stakeholder mechanisms at all levels, at global, regional, national, and local levels. Now, this discussion is certainly very timely, in particular against the background of the recent UN Food Systems Summit that Martina also referred to, and the follow-up processes that resulted from it, including the different multi-stakeholder coalitions that were formed and the national pathways for food systems transformations that were developed by numerous countries. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Carmen Torres, Sustainable Food Systems Expert at the United Nations Environment Programme, who is the lead author of the report National and Subnational Food Systems Multi-Stakeholder Mechanisms, and who will give a short presentation of the report's highlights, including its key findings and takeaways. Please, Carmen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patrick, and hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. It is my pleasure, an honor, but also a big challenge to present this one-year research and 200 pages report in 15 minutes, but I will try to do my best to do so. So I'm going to share my screen now. If there's a problem, please let me know. So Martina did a very good job in setting, let's say, like the big picture of how food systems are failing people on the planet. So I think I can go very quickly with the first slides and then go to the core of the study. So I will focus first on introducing these mechanisms that we studied. Then I'll just outline the research objectives. I'll give a few insights into the methodology. And then I'll focus, I won't have time to focus on the different cases. I'll just give like the short summary of the comparative analysis findings. And then we'll give 8 key takeaways for you to take home. Let's try to do this in 15 minutes. So as I said before, Martina already explained this in detail. We know that our food systems today are destabilizing our planet and failing to provide all people with healthy and nutritious diets. And there is a common agreement that we need urgent food systems transformation to achieve the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, etc. So we know that one of the underlying reasons why our food systems are failing is because of this governance issue where policies and institutions follow this linear and siloed approach that fails to address the complexity of the food systems. Besides that, we know that even if actors are really at the center of food systems, in general, in policy making, these actors are not usually able to express their voice and participate, especially the vulnerable and powerless. So there is a consensus, I would say, that to apply this systems lens to go beyond the siloed approach and also to include all voices of these actors, governments must rethink food systems governance. So that they can embrace a variety of voices, but also foster this food systems approach. So we have seen in recent years that there's an effort to do so, to try to develop these innovative governance arrangements to do that. And there has been a lot of new multi-stakeholder platforms, councils, mechanisms that are emerging all over the world. In general, these are participatory decision-making mechanisms that are created to advise, to develop, and/or to implement policies to promote sustainable food systems. So in principle, the rationale behind this development is that through the inclusion of the different food systems actors, these mechanisms are better positioned to embody the systems-based approach and also to foster this participatory policy making we want. So this is the rationale. But when we look at them, we see that they are actually very difficult to study. And one of the reasons is because they are really diverse. They can take different organizational models, names, roles, forms in relation to the durability, legal status, representatives. Some are informal, others are more formal, etc. And they can also operate at different geographic scales. So we have a big variety of these mechanisms. I call them friendly, that they are very different animals, and that's why also studying them is so difficult. So we see that this emergence of these mechanisms raises also a lot of questions and criticism, I would say, regarding the extent of their benefits, the limitations, and the performance. We see that evidence and data about the characteristic, the effectiveness, the results, it's very vague and very fragmented. So this is why our community of practice of the One Planet Network Sustainable Food Systems Program decided that we wanted to understand better these initiatives, their characteristics, the flaws, the success, and address in some way this knowledge gap. So we had like this very big ambition. So we set a general objective. We want to identify, study, and analyze 10 of these mechanisms. And we want to understand and share their contribution that they are making to embed this food systems approach in participatory policy making to support the transition we want towards sustainable food systems. So then we took different lenses and we say, okay, first we want to understand how national and subnational mechanisms are supporting governments to work more effectively with these food systems actors to integrate different food system policies at different levels with a more holistic approach. Then we also want to describe examples of concrete achievements that these mechanisms are making in relation to the promotion of more sustainable food systems. But we also want to capture the challenges that they are facing. We also want to understand their formats, the sustainability principles, and the key food systems priorities that they are addressing, the way they are engaging the actors and which actors, and analyze how all these structural and process factors influence the achievement of success, but also are also related to the challenges they face. And finally, we want to promote knowledge sharing and foster innovation in the way that these mechanisms collaborate to mobilize more support and support the emergence of them. So these mechanisms are so diverse and all over the world that we said, okay, we have to define some criteria to select these 10 mechanisms that we will study. So this is the criteria we defined. We wanted to select cases that brought different food systems actors together. So from all the different points of the supply chain and in an inclusive way. Also, we wanted to connect actors, mechanisms that are connecting actors with different food agendas. So from the environment, health, trade, agriculture. And we also wanted multi-stakeholder mechanisms that are already connected to the development or the implementation of an already existing holistic food policy, or at least that are supporting an attempt to develop such a policy. We also wanted to select mechanisms that where the national or subnational government has an active role, and we wanted also a geographical balance between them. So this was very challenging. I have to tell you, there's not a lot of them. So what we did, so at the end, so we developed a screening tool, we conducted some literature review, and we also conducted some interviews. And at the end, we selected these 10 cases. And you will find in our website a detailed description of each one of them. So we selected 3 at national level: France, the Conseil National de l'Alimentation; Denmark, Organic Denmark; India, Eat Right India. So this is the name of the country and the name of the multi-stakeholder mechanism. And then 7 at subnational level, the case of Ghent in Belgium, the Canton Vaud Food Policy Council; in London, the UK, the London Food Board; in Montreal, the Montreal Food System Council; in LA, the Los Angeles Food Policy Council; in Quito, the Quito Agri-Food Pact, or Pacto Agroalimentario de Quito; in La Paz, Bolivia, the Municipal Food Security Committee of La Paz, Comité Municipal de Seguridad Alimentaria de La Paz; and in Madagascar, the Antananarivo Food Policy Council. So what did we decide about the methodology? So as I said before, there's not a lot of data out there about these mechanisms. So the studies, we used a qualitative study methodology, and we based the findings on secondary data that is available out there, but we also developed 2 surveys to collect some primary data. So the first survey was addressed to the focal points, what we call the focal points, which are like the representatives from each one of the 10 case studies. And it was to gather basic information, let's say like hard or harder information about the cases, where we didn't need like in principle perceptions of the different stakeholders. And then the second one was disseminated to all the stakeholders networks, all the stakeholders participating in these mechanisms. And there we wanted to capture, as I said, when I outlined the specific objectives, we wanted to capture the perceptions of these different stakeholders about different aspects of the mechanisms, such as the quality of the dialogues, the quality of the leadership, the capacity of the mechanisms to really foster inclusiveness and participation, etc. So at the end, we had 121 stakeholders completing the survey. So which are the main findings? So we divided into 6 sections, the main findings of the comparative analysis. As I said before, you can read the individual cases. And of course, during the panel, you will have a lot of insights from some of the champions and the focal points of these multi-stakeholder mechanisms. I won't have time to go into detail now, but I'll focus on the comparative analysis. So when we look at all of them and we analyze the different results we obtained through the research, we see that first we have like a first group of key findings about what we call the foundational or structural factors. So we see that in all of them, it took more than political will to create an effective mechanism. So we always say political support and political will is important, but in general, it was the convergence of several factors that started the mechanism and made it effective. So it was, for instance, the passage of a law that stipulated the creation of the mechanism, a perceived problem of acute food insecurity in the city or in the country, and also there was also an important role of a champion who advocated for the creation of the mechanism, and in the panel you will have 3 of them. Then we know that we also know from these cases that building this collaboration takes time. It's not like a 1-year endeavor. For most of them, it took between 1 year and 4 years to achieve successful collaboration and the first results. We also know that funding is crucial. Almost all mechanisms have a budget to operate, and when they don't, or they have run out of funds, it makes that the work really difficult. So these mechanisms are successful in part because they have achieved to have a regular budget. We also find out that institutionalization is very important. All of them show some degree of embeddedness into the institutional arrangements of the city or the country. And we also find out that these mechanisms connect at different levels to promote a greater impact. So the ones at national level also operate at regional level and local level through the different institutions and a wider network of actors, and the ones at subnational level also have a focus that goes beyond the limits of the city and also includes the city region or additional higher levels. So the second group of findings is about the roles and the thematic areas addressed. So we see that the majority of them are indeed directly involved in policy formulation. This is indeed a very important role that these mechanisms play. And also stakeholders recognize the networking and the collaboration, the new collaborations between food system stakeholders as one of the key roles of these mechanisms. Another key role identified is lobbying and advocacy, and it's played by all the mechanism studies. On the thematic areas, we see that there's still a focus on agricultural production when we look at the key topics addressed. But when we look at the topics that the stakeholders think should be addressed in the future, and when we look also at what has been addressed in the policies, we see there are winds of change, that a focus on consumption, environmental issues, and a more holistic focus is really emerging and being integrated in the work of these mechanisms. So there's a growing uptake recognized by the stakeholders of the food systems approach. Then we have a third group of findings about what we call the rules of the game, the governance and dialogues. We wanted to understand the governance arrangements and the processes that make these mechanisms successful. So we see that in all of them, there's a wide range of food system actors involved and represented, so good representativeness. Then they all benefit from some level of government support, another important aspect for good functioning. And then two of the key, let's say, elements that we know are important for these endeavors to succeed, to set relevant goals, plans, and strategies, and also to apply good governance principles. And we see that in these 10 cases, they all have adopted these goals and set these good governance principles. Good facilitation is paramount. They all appoint a facilitator for meetings, a note taker, and we know that also from literature, this is a very important point to guide discussions, etc. One important finding is that only a few of these mechanisms have established procedures, specific procedures to address power imbalances and manage conflicts of interest, which seems to be a pending task, given this is one of the main criticisms these kind of multi-stakeholders endeavors receive. Then we looked at the stakeholder engagement, and we saw that there's a high level of participation and engagement of the different stakeholders. Of course, there might be a bias here because the stakeholders participating in the survey are the engaged stakeholders, of course. And we see that they all attended meetings very regularly, and government and private sector representatives also use a lot of verbal exchanges beside the meetings to communicate, which could reflect a more active use of informal lobbying to advance interests and policy priorities. When we asked about the motivations to participate in the mechanisms, networking, information, and learning are the three key strong motivations of participants to engage. They recognize that effective collaborative leadership is paramount and is, of course, good in their multi-stakeholder mechanisms. And one important finding about the stakeholder engagement linked to our recommendation is that most participants fund their participation from their own funds. So it seems to be that funding mechanisms to support the participation of the more disadvantaged groups that may not have the budget to participate is critical and should be, this is an issue that should be addressed. Then we have the lessons from policy formulation and implementation. And here one very important finding is that we see that in most cases, there's a twofold success, what we call the twofold success in embedding these food systems approach in policy processes. On the one hand, the majority of them have supported the formulation of a holistic food systems policy per se, but the majority of them have also contributed to embedding food topics in other related agendas, so in climate change agendas, or environmental agendas, or urban planning. So this is really what taking a food systems approach look like, right? Not only developing a holistic food policy, but also have policies in the different sectors take a more holistic approach and consider it also other elements that are related to the topic or to the sector. And then another important finding is that in all cases, the first key step was a holistic participatory food systems diagnosis, which served, of course, as a basis to develop then the policy. About the processes and these participatory processes, we found out that in general, the mechanisms use what we call the blended whole of society approach. They combine deliberative and participatory democracy methods. In general, there's a wider consultation at the beginning of policy development, followed by a more a smaller, let's say, deliberation inside the mechanism. It's not always like that, but it's followed by this deliberation in a smaller group to develop the final drafts, let's say. What we see also in the different cases is there's a high level of innovation in the way these mechanisms foster participation. And you will hear from this during the panel because there's a specific question about that. So we have Le Conseil National de l'Alimentation with a citizen that has just developed a new methodology to engage the broader citizenry. We have the impact, the collective impact model from LA. You will hear from that. There's a high level of innovation to really make an effort and foster participation. We also saw that dialogue is really like the key, let's say, tool used to address trade-offs and navigate controversial topics. Dialogue until consensus is made and trade-offs are achieved. And regarding the topics prioritized in food policies, we see that sustainable diets, food diversification, food environments, and local food production are still the key topics addressed. All the mechanisms also engage in policy implementation, but the level of engagement and roles played shows a big variety. Sometimes just monitoring of the implementation, and sometimes these mechanisms are really actively involved in the activities and the implementation. But just, I think I have to wrap up. So this is the last building block, let's say, of the key findings. And we asked the participants about the perceived achievements and challenges. So what, on the perceived achievements, the stakeholders agree that the networking of stakeholders is like the first achievement that they perceive. This, of course, is very important because it increases connectivity among food systems actors. And for instance, in the response to COVID, we saw that this prior history of collaboration and this connectivity made it easier to react and to implement responses to the COVID pandemic. The second perceived achievement is policy formulation, of course, and including the mainstreaming of food into other related policy processes. As I said before, this, let's say, like a twofold success that these mechanisms have achieved. When we asked about the perceived drivers of collaboration and success, 4 elements were highlighted. The balanced representation of all food system actors, so the fact that these mechanisms really bring together actors from the whole spectrum of the food system, the conducive leadership and governance, the trust built upon many years of networking and collaboration, and the perceived political support. And when we asked about the challenges, the main one is ensuring financial stability. And additionally, some participants identified the low political support and the limited time for stakeholders to engage in the additional activities demanded by the mechanisms. So this is a very short summary of the key findings. You can, of course, read the report. And when you will go to the website to download the reports and the different chapters, you will also see these 8 key takeaways that we highlighted for us. So I don't know, Patrick, I think I don't have time to read them. I don't think it's really necessary. But yes, and it is also in the website. Let me know, Patrick, if I can take 2 more minutes or I close here.
If you can do it in 1 minute, then
okay, 1 minute. Okay, so it's actually a summary of what I just said, of the comparative analysis. So one key takeaway that we can highlight is that these mechanisms can really help tackle the intertwined problems of climate change, biodiversity, food insecurity, etc., through this whole of society and sustainable food systems approach. Of course, provided they have different elements that we highlighted before. The second one is that we see that funding and institutionalization of these mechanisms and participatory decision-making processes is key. Then another one is, as I said before, the power balance gap. So while we have good representation of actors, good governance principles, etc., only a few of these mechanisms have established concrete procedures to address the power imbalances and manage conflicts of interest, which seems to be a pending task. Then also, as I said before, the participation is influenced by the power of money because in general, these mechanisms don't have specific funding mechanisms, not all of them, some of them have, but in general, they don't have specific funding mechanisms to support the participation. So the stakeholders have to bring money from their organizations or their pockets, sometimes in the case of farmers, to participate. Meaningful engagement and collaboration takes time. And we see that a prior history of collaboration, sometimes there was a prior multi-stakeholder initiative, and then, for instance, the Food Policy Council was created. That helps a lot. It builds trust. It creates this connection between the stakeholders. 6.1, blended deliberative and participatory democracy methods are used, as I said before, for consultation and policy formulation. Most mechanisms succeeded in formulating a holistic food policy, aided by this first step, which is the food systems diagnosis, but then they have also embedded food issues into policy process related to other agendas. So this twofold success. And the final one is that in most cases, to address the trade-offs and complex food issues, navigate controversial topics, dialogue is the tool that is commonly used, but better tools are needed for evidence-based decision making. So thank you very much, and sorry for using a few additional minutes. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you. I don't know if you can already see me. Yes. Thank you very much, Carmen, for this clear and very spot-on presentation of the report, the highlights of the report, and really congratulations on this very important, detailed, and well-structured comparative analysis across these 10 cases. I would just briefly like to take this opportunity to remind everyone, since some joined maybe a little later, that this report on multi-stakeholder mechanisms on sustainable food systems was commissioned by the Community of Practice for Food Systems Approach on the Ground, which is a platform of the One Planet Network's Sustainable Food Systems Program. It's a platform that connects partners across the world and across stakeholder groups, partners that are promoting a food systems approach. And this community of practice is facilitated by UNEP. And I would also like to take this opportunity right now to thank and recognize the important coordination role that UNEP had together with WWF and the Alliance of CIAT and Bioversity in the development of this report. Well, what struck me most personally, I think, is that the report seems to clearly point towards a role for multi-stakeholder mechanisms in different areas. But in particularly, I believe what struck me is that it has a role in tackling interrelated challenges that are inherent to food systems through a systems approach. And also in supporting decision-making processes for the formulation of holistic policies, more systemic policies. And there seems to be clearly also a role in helping to overcome power imbalances and addressing trade-offs. Now, this presentation therefore provides us with a perfect basis for the upcoming panel discussion, which will have a particular focus on 3 points, 3 areas. And these are the question of how to get effective multi-stakeholder mechanisms started and how to keep them going, how to ensure participatory consultation processes for policy development, and how to effectively address power imbalances in such multi-stakeholder mechanisms. It is therefore my great pleasure now to introduce our distinguished panelists, several of whom are representatives of the case studies that Carmen introduced, and several of which also contributed directly to the findings of this report. So I ask and invite all panelists now to open their cameras. We have Inoshi Sharma. She's the Executive Director of Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, the institution that hosts Eat Right India. Then we have Maria Teresa Nogales. She's the founder and Executive Director of Fundación Alternativas and the champion of the La Paz Municipal Food Security Committee. And next on our panel, we have Paul Holmbeck. And Mr. Holmbeck is the former CEO of Organic Denmark. And we have also on our panel, Ms. Paula Daniels, and she was the champion and is currently a board member of the Los Angeles Food Policy Council. Our 5th participant on the panel is Rotem Ayalon, the president of the board of Montréal Métropole en Santé, which is an NGO that supports the Conseil du Système Alimentaire Montréalais. And finally, we have on our panel also René van Benhuizen, and he is the program manager at HIVOS, and as well as the coordinator of the RUAF Secretariat. Now, with this great mix of distinguished speakers, and concrete examples of national and subnational experiences, I am sure that this will be a unique opportunity to discuss some of the key challenges and drivers of success of multi-stakeholder mechanisms in relation to food systems. So I hope everyone's ready for the panel discussion. Here's my introduction. We heard from Carmen that champions are key to the functioning of food systems multi-stakeholder mechanisms. With Maria Teresa Nogales, Paul Holmbeck, and Paula Daniels, we are lucky to have 3 champions of multi-stakeholder mechanisms on our panel. Maria Teresa, can you tell us more about your role in that function, in getting the mechanism started, and in getting the needed political support and stakeholder engagement to keep it going?
Certainly, and thank you so much for this invitation and for the opportunity to share our work with such an important audience. So our food committee is actually turning 8 this December. So we have been working for 8 years. And when we look back, I think some of the things that we rescue in terms of what helped us come up with a good recipe for success was actually, first of all, doing the research and generating the sufficient evidence to initiate the advocacy with our local officials. So from Fundación Alternativas, we were able to put together some information on the food systems, on food insecurity, and on the growing relation between food insecurity and urbanization. So once we had that information, we were able to approach elected officials at the local level and persuade them in terms of, just allowing us to do the work and being receptive to the policy work that they were going to be presented with in the future once the mechanism started functioning. And so I think one of the ingredients for success was actually just letting the local officials know that we weren't asking them to do more work, because I think that's one of the things that really makes elected officials hesitant, is to add additional items to their already very packed working agendas. So we basically said, we just need you guys to be receptive to, the work that we will be doing within the multi-stakeholder group, within the committee. And then once we have, policy proposals, perhaps sitting down a couple times a year. But what we definitely did ask them to do was designate people from the local government to participate on a monthly basis, because we do think that it's important for our elected officials to actually be privy to the analysis that are conducted on a monthly basis, and that they form part of the consensus that, are reached on a monthly basis in terms of, policy priorities and policy proposals that will be coming forward. So I think, doing the homework before and doing the groundwork, and then, making sure that authorities understand that we're not asking them to do more is fundamental. But I think, I think it's important and fundamental actually to know what you're talking about before you approach elected officials, because obviously, they don't have a lot of time. So I think that also helps you build that trust relationship from the very onset.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa, and you made a very important point there. I believe in the importance of effectively involving the local officials, and by establishing this trust from the beginning. Paul, from your experience, what is the key role then of a food systems multi-stakeholder mechanism champion? And what were the actions that you think made the difference in the case of Organic Denmark?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for this great report, the diversity of lessons from all over the world about driving food systems change. It's really incredible. I encourage people to read it. One of the differences in the Danish case, as opposed to some of the other great examples with food policy councils and others, is the role of the organic NGO in being a catalyst for policy and for mobilization of the food sector and all the many actors that we need in order to drive change. And one lesson early on was the need to bring the food sector together, the entire food value chain. We had 8 organizations. We merged, the first came into one house, then merged into one organization. And the power that that gave and influence in both policy and market and media was really exceptional. So we had farmers, food companies, people working in the public kitchens, cooks, et cetera, and also consumers in one organization. Then our whole approach to lobby work was very much that we solve problems. This food system change solves problems of interest to all kinds of politicians. So we took all parties in a dialogue. We now have support from 10 out of 11 political parties. And in that way, we could embed organic food policy in rural development, in climate policy, in biodiversity policy, and other areas, and really solve problems and kind of create this political ecosystem supportive of organics. Same approach to allies, climate organizations, environmental organizations, animal welfare, consumers, that we really needed knowledge from, but we also needed their help, their support. And a lesson really there was that the organic food system is kind of a good fit for multi-stakeholder work because the core values are so aligned with so many different societal interests. And organic farmers think holistically, so that it was easy to make allies. I think if I was going to give one really good example, that was our approach to conversion in the public kitchens, where we didn't just say we want organic food in the public kitchens. We brought a broad alliance where the trade unions for representing the people in the public kitchens were one of our strongest allies, to saying we want organic, but we also want healthier, and we want climate-friendly food, more plant-based, less meat, less waste, more purchasing in season, and available to all, in the schools and childcare and hospitals, military barracks, a broad alliance for this broader sustainability effort, which in this way is kind of more embedded now and rooted in all these different interests and really supported by people in the kitchen. So it's got this longevity. It even as policy kind of support goes up and down, it's still there. So that's some of the key lessons that I think we have from Denmark.
Thank you very much, Paul. And it's really very, very interesting how you managed there in that case to establish this broad alliance and to bring this into all these different policy areas. So I think a lot we can learn in other places from that case. Thanks a lot. Now, one of the key takeaways of the report that Carmen presented is that participation is key in multi-stakeholder collaborative initiatives. However, the way stakeholders engage in policy formulation and implementation varies greatly from one case to another, and sometimes the processes put in place receive criticism for not being truly democratic and legitimate. Now, my question to Paula, why do you think it is spot on to achieve democratic and legitimate participation in policy development? And can you give us another example from your experience as champion for the Los Angeles Food Systems Food Policy Council?
Yeah, I will say that I was pleased that as we were formulating the concept for Food Policy Council and took this to the mayor, I was a senior advisor in the administration of Mayor Villaraigosa at the time, that he was quite receptive to this concept. So one thing that I want to say I find quite critical is the nature of governance and the nature of the different administrations. So again, I was a senior official in the cabinet of Mayor Villaraigosa of Los Angeles when we created the Food Policy Council, which is the multi-stakeholder collaborative that was studied here. Villaraigosa was the first Hispanic mayor since 1872. His background had been in labor organizing, and he was very much in his core values in terms of governance geared toward inclusiveness and diversity in all of his government processes, as well as open and accountable government. So when in the very beginning of his second term, I had recommended to him that we start creating a multi-stakeholder collaborative, he supported the idea and it was part of the way we had been governing in any event. But food systems had not been on the radar of the city. So Los Angeles, again, in context, 7th most powerful global economy city in the world. It's the 18th largest economy in the world, ahead of Switzerland and Sweden. We were looking at a lot of issues, transportation, housing, a lot of other issues. But to get a city which was very urban to be focused on a systemic issue around food and not solely focused on the food security aspect, in other words, the delivery of services from purchase to plate, but to look at it systemically, was actually the innovation, was that we needed to look at it in those terms. And creating it as a multi-stakeholder collaborative was something we had already done. I had been involved in green initiatives. I had been involved in the Million Tree Initiative, so it was an urban forestry initiative to try and bring more trees back to the city, but we'd already looked at that as a multi-stakeholder collaborative and had looked at where there were trees versus where there weren't, and trying to be equitable in the management of trees. Same with green infrastructure. So we took this idea, it was our mode of operation of having all stakeholders participate in creating the policy and creating the structures and moving the policy ideas forward to the food system area, but in particular needed in the food system area. Los Angeles, I already mentioned how large it was in terms of the world economy, but also was characterized as the epicenter of hunger in the United States by the USDA. So we have these great extremes in Los Angeles. We have a lot of wealth and a lot of poverty at the same time. We have a lot of educational attainment and low educational attainment, all next to each other. So knowing that we have to work across these issues and work with stakeholders was again part of the process, but in particular for food, because as you all know, and I've called it this, the food system is the thing that moves the hand, but the food system itself has these distal impacts, in terms of local economies, environmental sustainability, fair labor, nutritional health, and so forth. So we were dealing with one issue, but we needed to deal with the system. So we drove it as a government-led process that was intended to be multi-stakeholder. Some people call these processes either grassroots or grass tops. The way I've called this one was full blade of grass. We're going to have everybody involved, so the whole blade of grass is involved. And I don't know, I forgot what your question was, but if you were talking about how we structured it, we started this in 2009. The mayor announced a task force, so that was the structure. I was advising him on who should be in the task force, and in the process of designing the task force and announcing it, there were a lot of one-on-one meetings. I firmly believe that change moves at the speed of trust. So had a lot of meetings with different stakeholders one-on-one, seeing what their issues were, what they would think about this process. We had meetings one-on-one, one-on-three, in-group meetings, testing out the concept, seeing if they would participate, and they all did agree. And then the mayor announced that we would do this, and then we embarked on what our process was from that point forward.
Thank you very much, Paula. It's quite fascinating to hear all these cases, and I think what I heard again, also here really the importance of trust, and interesting to see how you managed then to have focus on having all stakeholders involved in policy development. In this case, in a government-led process in a diverse and very big city such as a very large city as Los Angeles. So thanks a lot, and I would like to ask a question to Rotem Ayalon. I hope I pronounced it right. Rotem, can you give us an example of an innovative consultation process used to foster meaningful and legitimate democratic participation from your experience in Montreal?
Sure, thank you for having me. In Montreal, our Food Policy Council is 3 years old, but we were working on the food system before that with the Système Alimentaire Montréalais, just a concertation, so a group of actors, multi-stakeholder actors working around the table around the food system. But we solidified that by creating the Food Policy Council. And we don't have the luck as in LA of being based within the city. We have city members around the table, city actors from different services of the city around the table and who help fund the initiatives. But I guess what I can share is how we began with our first action plan for the new Food Policy Council 3 years ago. We decided to try to broaden the council. So the council is made up of 23 members who have been elected and as representatives of different sectors of the food system. But in order to create a plan that was broader and that has the participation of all actors, we held a forum that was open, and we reached out to citizens, to local organizations and all actors, farmers, to participate in a 2-day event where we set it up in a way, the best way we could to get involvement. And so at different levels, participants from a broad array of sectors were presented with findings. So we started with reports, with data and information. And we asked, first of all, to validate this data that researchers had helped us gather. Is this correct? Is this is this a good interpretation of the reality based on your experience and expertise? The next step was to identify actions and best practices in participatory workshops. So stakeholders could suggest additional actions, make changes to the proposed actions. And finally, we voted. So, we had 200 participants. We asked everybody to vote on the actions they thought that were the most promising. And this formed the basis for an integrated action plan for 5 years. Following that, and that's the action plan that the Food Policy Council was going to put in place. But then we also did a call for participation to have a collective action plan. So our Food Policy Council has a plan of how we want to address the food system and improve the food system in Montreal over 5 years. But we know that we don't work alone. There are hundreds of actors in the food system. And so we did a call out for them to contribute what they are working on in relation to 5 different areas around our food system. And so we have an action plan that's made up of almost 100 projects, and that we follow up every year, collecting data. How have their initiatives advanced? We have indicators, and this is our first collective action plan around the food system in Montreal, and we're very proud of it. So that was what I wanted to share with you here.
Thanks a lot, Rotem. It's certainly very inspiring, this collective action plan with indicators and all the actors involved. It's also a great example. Thanks so much. Now, another point stressed by the report is that there is an essential aspiration at the heart of food systems, multi-stakeholder mechanisms, to build more inclusive, participatory governance in which the voices of those most affected by the policy decisions can be heard and their rights defended. Yet the inability to manage power imbalance is one of the main challenges and also criticisms of multi-stakeholderism. And this raises questions about its legitimacy for food governance. With that, maybe I would like to move to some of the next panelists. René van Veenhuizen, can you give us an example of how food systems multi-stakeholder mechanisms can address this issue, the issue of power imbalances?
Yeah, thank you very much, and great to be with you. And I should say this study is really impressive, and some of the questions and discussions that you raised, they are all in this document, I think, and it's good to pick out some of them. About this issue of more inclusive participatory governance and dealing with power imbalances. I think you have to realize this with this multiple leveled, multiple layered, and multiple sectoralized food system, you can never get all the actors at the same table. And so with representation, the danger is always there that voices are unheard, or that some key partners that you would like to have on the table are simply not recognizing or the authority or the power of the platform that you're working on. And there are many examples of that, including supermarkets or big corporations. And exactly that was also the criticism that was raised during the UN Food Systems Summit. So a number of practices you can employ or that have been employed and experiences have been written is first and foremost, not to try to get everybody on the same table at the same time, but also work through working groups, particular thematic areas where people can meet and find out and try to resolve certain issues and report back to the larger food policy council or food platform or policy process. And a good example, I think, of that is you work particular for groups that have not been recognized in society and in informal sector. You work through so-called food labs, where you design a multi-stakeholder process at the local level with some key actors, not all of them necessarily, but start in exploring a particular issue, start building trust, and start trying to solve issues. A good example of that is the work that has been done by YIVOS, is still ongoing in Zambia, where food labs in a particular region where food is being produced, in Chongwe, is being connected to a food lab in Lusaka, where the food lab is working with the food vendors, the informal food vendors, and connection is trying to be made between those two sectors of the value chain to raise the availability of food, nutritious food on the one hand, and to reduce food waste on the other hand. And that all being reported back to the Food Council in Lusaka. I think that is a good example. Some other lessons I think that could be shared. One of them is that you have to acknowledge and work along and really recognize the regular democratic processes and power imbalances. And there's a lot of information on food policy councils, whether you want to be embedded in the government or local authority or not, whether you want to be financially dependent or not of this construction. But all these examples show you need to work along this regular democratic processes. And again, that was also part of the criticism, I think, on multi-stakeholder processes that do not recognize the power imbalances. I think some other strategies have been shown by the studies of the cases in this study. A very important one, and the Quito example shows that how long this process can take, but how important it is to have regular moments of putting agreements in action plans, in charters, in strategy documents, and communicate that properly to your constituency. Yeah? And I think those are a couple of examples. I think there's a wealth of more examples in this publication, so I would recommend reading them all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, René. Very, very useful. I wrote down the example of the food labs, but also the other examples that you mentioned. And yeah, so it seems it's really a very rich resource, this report. And I would go to our next, like to go to our next panelist, Inoshi Sharma. What are your suggestions on how multi-stakeholder mechanisms can address power imbalances and manage conflicts of interest more effectively?
So, like in India, as part of the Eat Right initiative, we started off, primarily focusing on 3 broad pillars, which is eating safe. So you take the entire aspect of food safety and hygiene into context. And the Food Safety Standards Authority of India, from where I belong, is actually primarily the apex regulator looking after food safety and hygiene. But having said that, what was also realized is that is not the only thing which affects, people's nutrition. It is also eating healthy and creating that awareness about having a balanced diet, reducing intake of salt, fat, and sugar, and eating sustainably, which encompasses not just organic farming, but also, reducing wastage of water, pesticides, toxins, and all those other things which come with that, plastics. Those issues are there. So when you try to broaden your entire, objective of your work to, encompass so many more objectives, you need something like a food systems approach, because you yourself or alone as an organization cannot do it. So what happens is you need multi-stakeholder discussions, you need dialogues, you need interface with such kind of a different organization. So for instance, at the national level, keeping with the UN Food Systems Summit, we were having dialogues And we had created a steering committee where we, interacted with a number of related departments and ministries, which are also looking after food. So for instance, the Women and Child Development Department, which provides food, or the Education Department, which provides food in school, were also roped in, or the Agriculture Ministry, or the Ministry for Small Scale and Food Processing, they were roped in. So that's at the national level. Now, how do you make sure that at the local level, where you have stakeholders who cannot always, voice their opinion or their concerns at the national level, how do you do that? So we sort of encourage the various states, because India is a federal structure. We encourage states at the local level to have these kind of dialogues. And to encourage these dialogues, we came out with the Eat Smart City Challenge. So about 108 cities in the country are participating in this challenge, in which they've all been asked in a matter of 4 to 5 months to prepare their own food vision. What sort of food vision do they see for their cities in the next 3 to 4 years? And how are they going to identify stakeholders and implement some of the programs that we were talking about at the national level? And on the basis of, their inputs, we will be selecting the top 11 cities and providing them with funding so that they can scale up these particular programs in the next 1 year. So such kind of challenges sometimes and dialogues do, create this buzz in a particular area with regards to their own issues, and also develop this consensus about safety, hygiene, and nutrition.
Well, thanks so much, Inoshi, for this also very inspiring example of how it has been done or can be done at a more local level and by means of using such a challenge. I really like it, Eat Smart City Challenge. Very interesting indeed, and a great example again for others. Well, we are running slightly behind schedule, but we will be able to discuss a little bit more now in the next setting of the Q&A. I would like to thank you all panelists for this extremely rich and exciting exchange so far. And the panelist discussion is closed, but we move to the Q&A session. We have received some questions already through the chat box, so please, panelists, remain here. Questions may, in addition, also be asked to the previous speakers. Yes, so thanks. I would like to thank Mariana Bortoletti and Anaïs Lecoq from UNEP that have been actively monitoring the questions that were submitted through the chat box so far. And this is your chance also to submit any additional questions that you may have in writing them in the chat box. But maybe to start this off, I noticed that there was some question or maybe remark with regard to the COVID pandemic. And I think that's a really interesting point. Several speakers have already kind of referred to the UN Food Systems Summit, which is of course also very important and related to the topic of multi-stakeholder mechanisms. But really the COVID pandemic has revealed and intensified many shortcomings of our current food systems. So I wanted to ask the panelists, and maybe to Maria Teresa, to start with, do you see a particular role for multi-stakeholder mechanisms to contribute to the COVID-19 response? And was or is your mechanism, your multi-stakeholder mechanisms in Bolivia actively involved in that process?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, great question. I think, COVID really put food on the table once again, in a matter of speaking. And I think it revealed that most of our food systems are very precarious and that we have definitely invisibilized our food systems. And so I think they were not necessarily up for the challenge of dealing with a pandemic. So in Bolivia, for example, there was a lot of anxiety about food shortage. And so I think in that regard, COVID has served as a wake-up call once again, that we need to invest in our food systems, and we actually need to rely on these multi-stakeholder working groups in order to really understand the needs and demands of every single food systems actor and sector. And I think in that regard, last year, I mean, I think like many other countries and organizations, there was a short adjustment period because we went into a very strict quarantine that lasted most of last year. And so, but, you know, it became evident, you know, early on and before the quarantine that our food system was not necessarily going to be able to guarantee access to food for every single household. And so our municipal food security committees, because we have more than one, we have several committees around the country, we're actually able to invest their efforts in designing the country's first food contingency plans for local officials. We were actually an entity that was being called on by local authorities in order to gain access to certain contacts to actors of the local food system. So farmer associations, informal vendor associations, market associations, because all of those are actually members of our committees. And likewise, you know, universities that belong to our committees were able to invest in conducting a lot of research and helping out. And I think what was interesting was to demonstrate that we had already cultivated a certain sensitivity around food systems and a certain understanding around food systems. And so it was very timely. And since last year, so certainly we're still living in the midst of a pandemic, but I think the dynamics are certainly different today. What's been really helpful is to make sure people understand that the pandemic was not an isolated event, but rather it's going to become a recurring event around the world. And we actually need to apply lessons learned and make adjustments to the many weaknesses that we found within our food systems last year. And so, yeah, I think COVID, you know, despite the many challenges and the difficulties, has definitely given us, I think, as a world, the opportunity to truly invest in committing to our food systems once and for all.
Thank you very much, Maria Teresa, and I see colleagues nodding. Is there anyone in the panel maybe who would like to add something to this question on the role of multi-stakeholder mechanisms in COVID response? I see
I'm
Paula,
happy to join in here.
Great.
Yeah, so one thing I want to mention as a preface to what I'm about to say that builds on what Maria Teresa just mentioned is that one of the successes of the multi-stakeholder collaborative of the LA Food Policy Council, which was created to exist outside of government, even though it was initiated within government, it existed outside of government and continues to this day, was the creation of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. So a program came out of our multi-stakeholder collaborative, the LA Food Policy Council, came out of one of the working groups and became a national organization. So it's a purchasing program that influences institutions on how they purchase their food. Again, developed by that group, and it's now working in a different process. What we've learned, though, in working now around the country with this program that was developed through that LA Food Policy Council, that is that where there were those multi-stakeholder collaboratives across the United States, they did have a better and more resilient response to COVID in the way that, you know, was mentioned. So those areas that had those multi-stakeholder collaboratives that were working on food in a systemic way, that also were supporting food hubs and shorter supply chains, were able to pivot and respond more in a more resilient fashion when supply chains shut down globally. So that was proof of concept in a lot of ways for all the things that COVID had revealed, that shorter supply chains, more regionalized food systems could be resilient. That had been our theory of change 12 years ago when I started work on creating the LA Food Policy Council. It was our theory of change, and it was, I would say that it was borne out in this time in a tragic way, but at least now we understand that these are the investments we need to make, and these investments are now being part of the policy articulation with our federal government to build out those shorter supply chains and support a more regional economy, food economy.
Maybe I can jump in terms
Yes, please.
for Montreal. I mean, I think the COVID pandemic really was able to be the selling point to explain to our elected officials and decision makers. They saw firsthand the role that a food policy council can play, and the importance that we make by connecting all of the neighborhood round tables and organizations, delivering emergency food. And the city itself cannot be in contact with the hundreds of actors who are on the ground, but the Food Policy Council can, and was very helpful during the pandemic, and our Policy Council has just published a report on the impacts of the pandemic and recommendations for the resiliency of our food system on different topics that has been very useful. And I think also funders, all of the private foundations were able to see the importance of this instance and the work on the ground and the collaboration and the funding that requires. So if we can look at it from another angle, the pandemic has helped us to better explain the importance of a food system network, whether it's a food policy council or a group of people working together, and that requires support, as you shared in your report, Carmen, that funding is important for this work to continue and to be able to be reactive in times of urgency.
Yeah, very, very interesting points indeed by both Paula and Rotem. Thanks so much. And yeah, really was really quite revealing how the pandemic has demonstrated the importance of food systems, and thus may have helped also, let's say, the cause of multi-stakeholderism, multi-stakeholder collaboration. Also, I think I would like to ask, we had several questions in the chat related to power imbalances. I think those have been touched upon, let's say, at least. Maybe I would like to go back to the point on the UN Food Systems Summit. Now, in the context of the recent UN Food Systems Summit, more than 100 countries have developed and submitted national pathways for food systems transformation in support of the 2030 agenda. And more are expected still to come in the course of the summit's follow-on process. Now, I wanted to ask the panelists, do you see a particular role for multi-stakeholder mechanisms in the implementation of these pathways, both at the national as well as subnational level? How can the findings of this report that we are discussing today support governments in moving their pathways from aspirations to actions? And yeah, I'm looking maybe at Renee, Inoshi, or Paul. Yes, Paul, you have your hand up, so please.
Yeah, I mean, I think multi-stakeholder bodies definitely have a role. I think one of the real breakthroughs in the Food Systems Summit was this systems approach to changing, to creating food sustainability. And instead of just turning a little more technology here, a little less waste there, et cetera, but really looking at a systems approach. And one of the coalitions that came out of one of the 7 coalitions that came out of the Food Systems Summit was on agroecology, which is a different food system, and which the summit pointed to as a strategy for both food security, but also for climate and nutrition, and biodiversity, not least. So I think this requires multi-stakeholder collaboration, because it's about farming, it's about supply chains, it's about changing the market, it's about landscapes, it's about rural development. And I think actually some of the cases in the report here are really interesting and could be applied to this agroecology coalition, where many countries are joining, and I would encourage others to also join, but also many organizations are backing up. So I think there's a lot of potential, but it requires an investment in capacity in these multi-stakeholder platforms, and I would say also in these agroecology and organic NGOs that can actually make the alliances and drive change. I see this in my own work with IFOAM Organics International and BioVision in a number of countries, where if the capacity was there, we could drive food systems change to a great degree. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Paul. We just have a couple of minutes left.
I was just going to jump in and say, I think
Great.
that that's true, just to build on what Paul said, because I mentioned to you that there are multi-stakeholder collaboratives in other areas, in forestry and water, but nowhere is it needed more than in the food system, because the food system has been disaggregated from a power standpoint and the issue standpoint, and the collection of advocacy ecosystems around each issue area had traditionally been disaggregated. There were the farmer and supply side, there was the hunger side, and there was the environmental side and the labor side, and they didn't always work together. And that's the absolute value of food policy councils and the multi-stakeholder collaboratives that you've mentioned. It brings people together that otherwise wouldn't have an opportunity to work together, that do contribute to the food system, and it's really crucial in order to make change.
Thanks a lot, Paula. Yeah, and also to Paula for pointing out the example of the Agroecology Coalition as kind of an example of another food systems with a holistic approach. And then, yeah, the need of really bringing everyone together. Thanks, Paula. I would like to just read a comment that I just saw from Florence Egal in the chat, and she mentions multi-stakeholder platforms or mechanisms, partnerships would be instrumental in following up on and building upon the work initiated by the UN Food Systems Summit. They would probably be useful to most coalitions and contribute to bring them together. And I think that's a very valid point. Thanks a lot, Florence, for sharing that. And yes, with that, I am afraid that we have come to the end of this Q&A and panel discussion. So thank you very much to all, a big thanks to all of the speakers for their very, very important contributions. And we could probably go on for hours or for at least for another hour with this fascinating discussion on how multi-stakeholder mechanisms can serve as an important tool in support of the transformation of our food systems. The discussions were extremely rich, and I will not attempt to provide you with my summary points at this point. Instead, I am lucky to be able to hand over to Mark Lundy now for his wrap up and final remarks. Mark Lundy is the Research Director on Food Environment and Consumer Behavior at the Alliance of Bioversity International and CIAT. Please, Mark, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, and thanks to all of the wonderful panelists on the call today, and of course thanks to Carmen for the wonderful report. So I think this is a very timely discussion. It's been raised by many of the panelists, and it clearly comes across in Carmen's report as well. We need to rethink how we manage food system governance, and I think the panelists and I think the cases in the report that Carmen has provided give some inklings of how this can work. And we have a range of experiences, both from the global north and the global south, that show how multi-stakeholder platforms as one mechanism can help to influence and connect to food system policy discussions and policy making. I think there's some issues that have been highlighted by the panelists that are worth bringing up again. One is the necessity to bring in multiple voices. Nobody has no one's cornered the market, if you will, on solutions to food system issues, and no one actor can on their own resolve these complex issues that we're dealing with. Paola made the point about talking about collaboration moving at the speed of trust. I think that's a very, very good point. And I think multi-stakeholder platforms as a vehicle can be effective in helping to build that trust and build dialogue. The case from Bolivia as well that we heard from, these are processes where you begin to build collaboration, you begin to build dialogue, and through collaboration and dialogue, you begin to build trust. And this allows you to reformulate, imagine, if you will, food system governance, and how that might work in terms of decision making going forward. The other thing I would say that's very important, and it's been touched on in the presentations today and in the report, is this issue of managing power and knowledge, I would say, asymmetries and imbalance. Clearly, this is an issue. I think we're talking about a system where you have significant differences of knowledge, capacity, economic, political, social power. across multiple actors in the system. And I think in order to achieve more optimal solutions around governance in the food system, we need to find ways to begin to balance some of these inequities. It's not an easy task, and I think there are multiple ways to achieve this. Again, some of the cases we've heard from bringing multiple stakeholders around the table and how you can support particularly those who have not necessarily been seen as relevant actors to have voice and to be able to be much more active in their participation is really, really important. And so this takes different forms. But again, I think the first step is being aware of these dynamics and really beginning to see what makes sense in the specific context in which the multi-stakeholder platform you're working on is engaging. And then there are several operational issues that have been touched on over the course of the call today that I think are important. I mean, clearly this idea of a stable funding stream, whether that be public, whether that be private, whether that be a mixture, is important. Maintaining these processes over time, I think, is another one of the issues that again it highlights the cases that have been successful. So this isn't a one-off. This isn't something that you can say, wow, there was a food system summit, let's build this thing and solve all of our problems. That's unlikely to work. These are processes that require ongoing, they need nurturing, they need investment, they need passion, they need a range of capacity development. And so I think we've heard all of these from the panelists. And so it's very much an organic process of growing these coalitions and growing these multi-stakeholder platforms so they can become more and more effective over time. And I think that also leads me to the point, which is this idea of alignment and dialogue leading finally to a more focused coalition. And so I think coming in, I think one of the things we've seen across the cases, and we've heard again today from the panelists, is you may start from a very dispersed group of actors in the food system. And only through this iterative process of coming together to discuss, to debate, to share information, to share insights, to pilot, to try things out on an ongoing basis, can you begin to build a common agenda that perhaps has the capacity to shift the way food system governance works in specific contexts. So again, it's this idea of going from dispersed, disconnected, right, through to collective, collaborative, and shared vision. And I think, again, this is something that comes across in almost all of the cases, but again, is not achieved overnight with no one has a magic wand to say, here it is, it's done. And then, so I just wanted to finish with a couple final remarks here that I think are important. And I think one of them is the need to really use these governance mechanisms to highlight the systemic nature of the food system. That's been raised at several points by several of the participants, and it's really important. And by highlighting the systemic nature of the food system, we also highlight almost by definition, the necessity to understand that there are going to be trade-offs when you talk about food systems. It's nearly impossible to optimize a food system that ticks all of the, Paulo's 5 fingers or whatever, however you want to define it. It's nearly impossible to optimize a food system that does all of this at the same time, at the same level of effort, and that same level of success. So we need to really think about how do we keep the system in view, and how do we also think about how to deal with these trade-offs and people who are going to benefit and people who may lose in some of the solutions that come forward. And I would say both are equally important, because both can either move the system forward or torpedo the whole process. So it's very, very important to think about these trade-offs and how do you manage trade-offs as we go forward. And then just 2 quick points to end here. One, I agree that this is a very timely report coming after the Food System Summit. Clearly, multi-stakeholder platforms need to be strengthened and need to be supported more actively as one of the vehicles to really move from this idea of desired food system transformation to actually food system transformation on the ground in practice in multiple locales around the world. So this kind of a report is timely because it can support national and subnational processes that are coming out of the Food System Summit to move from concept to action. And I think this is a very useful way to learn from some of the pioneers who are on the panel and others who are not, how this has worked in the past. But then there's also this global discussion about how to support multi-stakeholder platforms is particularly relevant for the Rome-based agencies and the UN family in general that will be tasked with helping to support country and national and subnational governments going forward. So let's talk about learning from these processes, both at the national and subnational level, but also as a global vehicle, and how we can continue to improve and optimize this. And finally, I mean, this is it's almost trite to say at this point. But the problems we're dealing with the food system are definitely global in nature, and we see them. It's a systemic issue. But yet most of the solutions that seem to be effective and useful are those that are pragmatic and that are rooted in local processes. So this kind of an approach around multi-stakeholder platforms to really move the local processes forward and help them connect to the national and the global processes is really, really important. And I want to thank again the panelists and obviously Carmen for her hard work on their support, because I think it really helps highlight this connection between the need to understand the global but act in a very concrete, pragmatic, often local way. So thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be able to work on this report with everybody. Back to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for these very thoughtful and spot-on closing remarks. And likewise, it's been a pleasure for myself as well to be part of this group and of this webinar. Yeah, I think it was really very spot on. And I liked one thing in particular that you said, multi-stakeholder mechanisms, they need nurturing. And so let's nurture them together. Let's grow them together. So this is not the end of multi-stakeholder mechanisms for food systems transformation, ladies and gentlemen, but only a start. So please stay engaged and connect with us by downloading the report on the website of the One Planet Network's Sustainable Food Systems Program, and help us spread it within your networks, including in support of implementation of national pathways and other results of the UN Food Systems Summit. And please do get in touch with us in case you would like to get more information on the One Planet Network's Sustainable Food Systems Program and connect to the initiative on multi-stakeholder mechanisms. With this, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to everyone who made this webinar possible, the organizers, the speakers, the authors of the report, Carmen, the main author, the members of the SFS program's Community of Practice on Food Systems Approach on the Ground, and all other colleagues involved, with a special shout out to Michael Mullet from WWF, who has been ensuring the smooth running of the webinar behind the scenes. And last but most importantly, a big thanks to all of you in your offices and at home for your participation and active contributions over the last 90 to 95 minutes. We're a few minutes over time, but thanks so much for staying with us until the end. All the best and enjoy the rest of the day.